Welcome to Classical Etc., a show that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
All right, well, welcome to the next episode of Classical Etc. And on today's conversation, we're talking about a topic that Paul actually brought up. The topic of what does a fully formed graduate of a classical school look like? We've talked about the fully formed person, what it looks like when in our lives trying to aspire towards the life of the mind and things like that. But what about a student? What do we want them to be when they reach 18 years old? Martin, what are the things that come to mind when you think of what should a student be when they graduate a classical school?
A better human being. Somebody who has a general education. I think, the tendency in education today is to want to produce some kind of specialist. And particularly in the early grades, before going to college, I think that's a really bad goal. I think, we want to, the ideal used to be we want to produce a child who's had a broad liberal arts education. It used to be until the end of college. Then you would specialize, right? That's why there's all those liberal arts colleges that call themselves liberal arts colleges out there. And then I think we, as education in this country deteriorated, that goal went to 12th grade. And now it's been eliminated altogether. And I think we suffer because of that. And even specializations suffer as a result of that because you're a better specialist if you're also a good generalist.
So what do you think of AAU sports and things like this in our culture? Do you think that they are affecting the education that our students are receiving?
Sports? Oh, well, sure. I mean,
AAU sports specifically
right.
is where kids are joining these like basketball teams at age 10 where they're traveling year round.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a whole...
I didn't know what you were talking about.
Yeah, well, and I have a whole speech on that because I had a son who's very athletic.
Oh, please.
And no, but he was specializing. I mean, it's the same thing in education. I mean, he was specializing in soccer. And if I had to do it all over again, he was also a very good basketball and played AAU basketball. But then he dropped out of that to specialize in soccer. If I had to do it all over again, and he agrees with us today, that I would have had him play basketball also. I mean, because now all these sports are all season. Soccer never sleeps.
Right.
I mean, they're playing in the tundra in Tennessee near the end of the year for these tournaments and everything. It's ridiculous. When I was in high school, I was on the high school soccer team, and when the season was over, we put the ball away and didn't even look at it until the next season started next year. So he says today, he would have been a better soccer player if he had been in other sports too. And I think that same principle goes for education.
Sure.
And you used to say, I know you told at least Nick's class that if they wanted to be teachers, they should not major in education. They needed to major in something where they would actually become an expert in something.
Right. I mean, yeah, in a way, that's just a fake major, to be quite honest. I mean, you want to major in the thing you're teaching, not in the methods by which you teach it, which are really ultimately very simple.
But the whole point about like not specializing early, I think we fall into the trap of that as classical educators, that what we're specializing in is classical education, rather than we are generalists. We are giving you a broad education because we can think, well, we're headed towards classical education. So when my kid goes off to college, my kid should go to a liberal arts institution and just study the liberal arts, rather than, well, no, this child has a wonderful broad education. They can go study wildlife management. They can go study engineering. They can go study whatever they want to specialize because they've gotten that broad education. And I feel some people don't. I don't feel the freedom to say, okay, now that we've accomplished this liberal education or we've gotten a broad base, now, let's go do something different in college. Let's go major in something specific.
Yeah, you might be making the same mistake progressive educators are making if you think every one of your students should major in Attic Greek when they get to college. Like, hopefully maybe one, if that's what they're interested in, but the rest will use their Greek base to be a better engineer or something.
We do need them, right, to continue the movement, right? You need those experts to be the teachers, to give that broad education. but it doesn't have to be everybody.
Yeah.
And you see this in science, that the great German scientists of the 19th century had studied Greek and Latin and the classics. That was their foundation for science. You see the same thing with the relativity revolution. You know, Einstein was he had a classical education. So did Niels Bohr, who helped develop quantum physics. And they would say, if you talk to those kinds of people, they will tell you this. One of the great books that's come out about this, and it also has to do with athletics, is the book Range. And the subtitle is something like How Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. His primary example of this is science and how all these technical disciplines, and he points out that scientists, you look at the greatest scientists, and they have a broad education. And the greater scientists they are, the more widely educated they are, and the more hobbies they have, and avocations, and this sort of thing. We don't understand the power of generalism, I don't think, in modern education.
I've heard it said that Einstein was, obviously better at math than me, but wasn't the superior mathematician. It was that he was such an imaginative guy that the thought experiments he was able to accomplish gave him new ways of looking at the data that other people weren't.
Well, I think the mathematician thing, the mathematics in Einstein is overplayed. He wasn't as good as some of the really, really good ones who were, but he was an A-B student in math. Yeah. But that's true. I mean, all of the relativity revolution would not have happened if it hadn't have been for the fact that he had an imagination and he was near a bunch of trains and clocks, because that's a lot of his examples, is trains and clocks, because he was a patent clerk in Bern, Switzerland, where the trains were always coming through.
Yeah. So Tanya, when it comes to the actual brick and mortar school building or, the homeschool, how does the classical approach create this well-roundedness, maybe in contrast to other approaches to education?
Well, because it's general, we're studying everything and studying it broadly. We're not, I know there are, I don't know at what age, but I've talked to people whose children were in schools where we became in tracks, like by 7th grade, where they just decided, well, we're interested in math now, so we're going to go to the math track, or instead of just letting them all get the same education. I don't know if that's still happening or not.
Well, and it's very prevalent in Europe too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I mean, that just seems crazy to me. I feel like, go ahead.
I was going to say, in my county, they basically require them to have a major, now they may not still have this was about 5 years ago, they required them to have a major in 8th grade.
I'm trying to think what I would have, in 8th grade, what would have been my interest besides boys. I honestly, I'm sure it wasn't this, but it wasn't this in college either. I mean, I took that general education too far, maybe. I remember my dad saying, I was at a liberal arts college, he was paying for it, saying, so you're going to teach? And I said, no. Then why are you majoring in English? What are you going to do with this? Well, I just like it. I like those classes. I had no plan for my life. At that point, I should have been specializing. And he was trying to make me do that. But
look how it turned out.
Well,
it turned out great, didn't it?
And you ended up with a love for learning, right?
Yes.
I think that's important of a graduate, right? Like,
yes.
This isn't just something we beat them over the heads with for 12 years, 13 years, and then go, well, you'll never see this again in your life, right? Like, you wanted to just continue on studying. Right?
And well, the sad thing for me was that I had a terrible public school education. And so I really didn't develop a love of learning until that liberal arts college. Mm-hmm. I really credit those professors with my love of learning because I was not prepared for college, but I really loved it. I loved the classes. I loved all the generality. And I think that's what we're doing in classical education is we're allowing students to know a lot of different things so that then they can make good decisions about what they want to do with their lives. And that when they do it, that they're going to be better, more ethical, have higher moral standards because of the kinds of things that we're studying. Sure. It doesn't matter if they're a firefighter or a doctor or just work in a factory, but that to be a well-rounded, fully formed human is what we're doing.
I was an economics major in college, and I was taking philosophy classes for fun. And I realized at one point I only needed one more course to complete the major requirements. So I went ahead and did that, and then declared a philosophy major too. So I did two majors, and my dad asked me one day after he found it, he said, "Well, what are you going to do with that?" And if I was faced, I never was, but if I was faced with the same situation with my children and they were majoring in philosophy and economics, and they majored in philosophy first and then declared an economics major too, I would have said, "What are you going to do with that?" Because that would have been really, as my life has developed, the philosophy degree was far more valuable, even when I was in banking, than the economics degree.
I want to touch back to something you said earlier, Martin. You were saying that there is a role for the specialists. What do you mean by specialists, and what is the role of a specialist, since we've just spent a lot of time defending general education?
Well, I mean, people go into different specialties. I mean, that's the thing now. Everything's a specialty now. If you went back several hundred years, people say that Erasmus was the last thinker who had mastered everything at that time in terms of knowledge. There's nobody can do that anymore, because there's so many things now, and they're so advanced and they're so specialized that if you're going to do that thing, you need to be trained in it, not educated in it, but trained in it. That's a different thing. Training is different from an education. And having that broad education coming to that, you're able to see it in a way that you would not be able to see it if you had just specialized in that one thing.
I think that's the key right there, is that you are able to look at it from a different place.
And then you wouldn't have people like Edwin O. Wilson, the guy who created sociobiology. And his problem was that all he knew was ants. From the time he was little, all he studied was ants. So the whole theory of sociobiology, which everybody attacked from every different political angle, was because it reduces human beings to something less than human beings. And it's because he saw human beings as ants. I mean, this is the kind of distortion you can get from specialization.
He was considering the ant, and I respect
so
that.
It's not bad for a guy to devote himself to studying ants, but he's got to have that broad education first
to know that, to know even the limitations.
Just be clear, we like people that study ants. Just to be clear, I mean,
it's well documented on this program that you're interested in specialist things like the dung beetles on your farm.
I don't know that we ever talked about dung beetles, but I'm glad that's come up. It's fascinating.
But you agree.
I think it keeps coming up.
Don't encourage them.
We need to stop that conversation.
What was your point?
Yeah, so just the question, you've spent a lot of time specializing now on the farm, but do you find that this point is true of your experience on the farm?
Oh, absolutely. And I learn a lot from people that grew up on the farm, right? And I always put their knowledge ahead of my own based on, whatever I've read or whatever I've learned from other people, because they've done it their whole lives. But then sometimes I'm sitting here going like, what? We complain about losing hay because it's in a hay ring and the cows are eating it, they trample on it, whatever. I'm like, can we just put a pallet at the bottom of that hay feeder so that the hay bale sits on top of the pallet? And so it doesn't get into the mud and it doesn't, end up rotting. And I remember asking my neighbor, who has been a tremendous help, and he was like, I've never thought about that before. Like, give that a shot. Let me know how it goes. And it's just because when you're specialized, you just do kind of what you've been trained to do, and coming at this from a perspective of,
somebody who's been dealing with books on pallets for years.
That's right. I know pallets are easy to obtain, right? But it has been helpful because I have been trained to look at it from the big picture rather than just, this is my one little thing. Like all I do was chickens, right? I mean, Tanya came over to my house delivering cats the other day.
There are chickens everywhere.
She's like, you have a lot of chickens. I'm like, they're living their best life. They love it. But I'm also trying to think about those chickens in relation to the cows, in relation to the pigs, in relation to the ground, in ways that, there's a lot of people farming that have done that way before me. But it was that sort of generalist approach that really caught my attention and said, wow, this is farming that's not specialized. It's farming that's broad-minded.
And I think we should say that your chickens are not all pinned up together. You do have a lot of chickens, but they are literally running all over the yard.
That is correct.
They're free chickens.
Are they walking in and out of the house? That's the question.
I didn't
Not
see
yet.
any walking in the house,
Not
but it
yet.
would have been possible.
Yes.
My father was an engineer, and he was the head at the time of the payload processing for the space shuttle. And they couldn't figure out if they had to abort a launch. There's only 2 places in the world they could land them. So one of those places, if they landed it there, of course you land and it's the shuttle is horizontal. Well, and the cargo's still in there because you didn't get it out into space and let it go. And so they couldn't figure out how to get, because the way you put cargo in space shuttle is it's sitting there on its back, on its tail, and they put it in this way, and they have a special machine to do this. Well, what happens if it's sitting like this? It's in some other country. How are they going to get the stuff out of it so they can get the shuttle, empty shuttle, back here on the top of a 747, which was how they did it. And so for weeks, he's out there hammering in the garage because his dad was a carpenter, and my dad was, practically speaking, a carpenter. And he just took just something from really another kind of thing. Carpentry's not engineering. But he things he knew from carpentry, and he builds this little thing and he brings it in one night. He says, I solved it. He's got little hydraulic things and levers and all this stuff. And he brought it in the next day to the committee of people working on it. And they said, yeah, that's it. That's the solution. Because he knew carpentry in addition to knowing engineering.
Yeah, that's cool. So Tanya, you had an insight when we were talking about this topic that I thought was really important. And that is, we talk a lot about creating well-formed students, but a part of that process, kind of counterintuitively, that's maybe not just classical education, it's just wisdom, is that classical education isn't the only thing if you're going to form well-rounded students. There's other things that need to be a part of the process. What are those things, and why do you think that that's an important point?
Well, the point that we make all the time is that, our curriculum is ecumenical. So we're not teaching doctrine to students. Because we feel like that's the responsibility and the privilege of the family and the church. And so we're not alone on this journey. We're not just letting your kids out of the car at carpool to take care of their education 100%. It's a partnership. And the homeschooler, it's easier for,
Sure,
because they're in charge of everything. But for the student that goes to a school, we can't let go of the responsibility that we as parents have and that churches have to educate students. And so that's one thing that that they need to take care of. And the other things are these, when my son was here at HLS and his friends were all in the public school system where we lived, they had classes like practical living, which would teach them like how to maybe balance a checkbook, or I don't know, how to brush their teeth. I don't know.
Skill that we need right
but
now.
I just thought, why is the school doing this? Why? And I do know that there are a lot of students in families that don't get that, but that's really not, that's what we are not doing that here. We are educating children academically and trying to form their characters. We have manners and etiquette. I was at a kindergarten opening assembly. I don't know. I ended up there earlier than I thought, so I had to stand through their little opening assembly, which was about voice volume and how, telling these 5-year-olds that they needed to have the correct volume of voice for the place where they were, and the difference between being in a playground and being in church or being in the classroom. And, so those things we're doing, but the parents have to help us with that too.
Well, and all the parents have probably said that, and we're reinforcing
That's
that.
right. That's right. Well, so it's a partnership. It's not, you can't depend on the school to raise your child.
And I mean, what the school does, or your homeschooling classically is continue the culture that hopefully is coming out of the family and out of the church, right? And so it's not, again, the school's not trying to take on those responsibilities, but we are actively working to support them.
Yes.
And so we are as much invested in trying to make sure the kid comes out as a virtuous graduate as hopefully the church and the family are, but we recognize that we only play a part in that.
Right.
And so we're gonna require behavior and discipline and that sort of stuff. But we recognize that, while we might give them some spiritual motivation for that, that's really coming mainly from the church and the family.
And that the consistency is so important for the children, that the things that are important to us, it's important for the parents to know that too, to know what we are doing, to take the responsibility to know, so that they are supporting those things at home, like getting your homework done. How to sit at the table for dinner is how we want to sit at the table at lunch. I had a student once who never had his Latin homework. And so I've lowered his grade for that. He was an A test student, but I lowered his grade because he never turned in his homework, which was a part of his responsibility. And so the next day after the report cards came out, and I put on the report card why, he called me out in the hall and he said, "My dad told me I need to apologize to you because I don't ever have my Latin homework." And I said, and it was a very nice apology. They had obviously worked on it. And I thought, this is really nice, for the father to talk to him and tell him why this was wrong. And I just thought, he has really learned something here. So we go back in I told him it was fine. It was a new day. We go back in and I started to take up the homework for that day and he didn't have it. So my bubble burst. But it was a beautiful apology.
So let's end on this. A lot is made in popular culture, in the news, of the current generations, just the way that they've been shaped by the rapid advance of technology in our country and all the different things that are diminishing children's attention span and all of these different things. And every generation has its issues, but our generation, the current generation certainly has some because of social media and television and all of these things. How do you guys think, considering the picture of a high school graduate, how is classical education specifically an antidote to our current culture's kind of forming presence? And describe what you think a young man or young woman should be like today when they graduate. What are the characteristics of that young man or young woman?
I would say that they need to know their own history and culture and where it came from. I think, in a sense, modern students are modern children, young people, are in a sense raising themselves because they're not having their culture passed down to them. I may have said this before on the show. I've been saying it a lot recently. is that our children are not even aware of what their parents and their grandparents' culture was like. They don't. When I was young, we had 9 channels in Los Angeles where I grew up, and there were old movies and there were cartoons that were constantly referring back to previous generations and the movies and culture of previous generations. Our kids now are so focused on the now. They have no clue what it was like for me to grow up. Our generation, what it was like for my grandparents' generation to grow. They have no clue. They're not interested in it. They're not told that. And there's no automatic mechanisms like popular culture was in my generation. It did that automatically. It doesn't do that anymore. It's all focused on today. The news cycle has been reduced from, a month 100 years ago to about 24 hours now.
Or
It's
just immediately on my smartwatch.
Yes, right. It's the dominance of the now, and because of that, they become very, very narrow in their outlook.
I think a huge reason for that is that we no longer live together as extended families. I think the mobility, and I mean, my family is the worst. My brothers we are not anywhere near each other. But I think those days, and it was mostly agriculture, I think, when extended families lived, like when you took in your parents and your children had that constant multi-generational experience, I think to me that's a huge loss.
Well, that's part of it. But the other problem is even when they're all living in the same house, the children are in their rooms with their smartphones, and they're living.
Everybody's not together in a community together.
Well, and I kind of what you were talking about, knowing your history and culture, and what I was thinking was back to that sort of broad-mindedness and generalist idea of just. I was thinking the exact same thing about living in the now, and how what we hear today, we're like, oh, that sounds reasonable. But we forget about what we heard a month ago, that it was complete in contrast. And so what we're here, very few people sit there and go, those two things don't match up, right? And so the idea of bringing children up in a way that as Cardinal Newman put it, right, truth is one, and then we need to be able to reason for first principles. But if truth is one, then what was true yesterday it should be true today in the same way and in the same respect, right? Mm-hmm. And so having students with this, I hate the word worldview, but I'm going to use it, with this worldview of that the truth is one and is unchanging in perennial things. I think talk about antidote, right? I mean, that solidifies them and kind of sets that foundation of, I can't be buffeted around. Nope. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't change our minds when truth becomes more apparent to us, right? But that we're able to say, I was wrong about that. This is clear to me now. But to have that solid foundation of truth, I think is huge.
And this relates back to classical education, because the whole methodology by which classical education purports to make better human beings is by passing on the culture to them, and the Western culture in particular. You have a much better perspective on the present if you've studied history and all the things that have happened in the past, and all the way people have solved problems in the past, and what they've done in the past. I mean, that's what distinguishes classical education from other kinds of education, precisely.
Yeah, and that issue of generational contact. At one point, families lived together, and you could have met someone who was older than you just in your community. That kind of diminished, but you could at least still meet people who are older than you at church. But now you have contemporary service and traditional service.
That's true too.
So you're not really meeting people at church anymore who are older than you. But money still drives our country. And so at least you're going to meet people older than you at work. Your boss is usually going to be older than you. But now you work.
Are you saying something about my age?
No. We're all, of course, we're all peers here.
You're sitting here with gray hair. Is my hair gray?
So who's the boss here?
Yeah.
There's a reason for that, though. We won't talk about it.
A reason for that my hair's not gray.
Yeah.
If we were lucky enough to work remote and not work with our bosses, then we wouldn't necessarily even know how old the people are that we're working with. I mean, everyone is really equalized by that remote technology, and so I think that generational gap will continue to grow.
I think that's right.
I'm afraid so. It's sad. Are we ending on a sad note?
Well, no. It's the reason why we need classical education.
That's right.
What a positive way to end.
Yeah.
And if you're really going to classically educate, move the grandparents in.
That's right. Well, my kids, I feel like neither one of them was a good student, but they went into college able to think for themselves. They knew what they believed. They knew why, but they also were open to change. And I think that is a huge point that you made, is not that, yes, we recognize, we've studied, they've studied, all the mistakes people have made, all the good things they've done, what it means to have courage. But there's also that open dialogue that says, I'm at this place now, but I continue to learn. I mean, that's the whole.
An open pursuit of the truth.
Yes, that we are constantly still open to learning. We're not finished. We're never finished.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, that's our episode. Thank you. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Classical Etc. If you'd like to show your support for the show, then you can leave a like below. If you'd like to add your voice to the conversation, then you can comment. And if you want to follow along with us on this journey, then please subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you later.